Maybe he said it, and maybe he didn't. But Meyer Lansky will forever be identified with the statement that the syndicate, the underworld conglomerate of hoodlums, mobsters, and killers from across the nation, was bigger than U.S. Steel. The boast made for good headlines and helped politicians like Estes Kefauver and Bobby Kennedy build their reputations and later achieved near-factual status when Hyman Roth, the Meyer Lansky-inspired character in The Godfather 2, repeated it to Michael Corleone. Whether or not Lansky ever really said it, it was probably true. Organized crime in America from the 1930s to the 1980s was big business, and Meyer Lansky had helped make it that way. There's a lot about Lansky that's apocryphal. Did he, for instance, meet Bugsy Siegel and Lucky Luciano on the same day? Probably not, but the story still floats around about how Lansky, the hard-working son of Jewish immigrants, happened along one day and found Siegel and Luciano brawling over the favors of a prostitute the Italian was pimping. Lansky, the story goes, hit Luciano over the head with a tool from his apprentice's box and stopped the fight. The known facts fit. Luciano did run some bordellos, and no one disputes that Bugsy Siegel liked the ladies. But Lansky never mentions the story in his authorized biographies, and Luciano remembers meeting Lansky when Lucky's gang tried to shake down the young Meyer and was told in no uncertain terms to go F themselves. "Okay, little man," Luciano remembers telling the diminutive Lansky, "you get your protection for free." "Shove your protection up your ass," Lansky shot back. "I don't need it." And Lansky, who had never grown much above 5 feet, proceeded to prove it to the older boy. "Believe me, I found out he didn't need it," Luciano recalled years later. Next to Benny Siegel, Meyer Lansky was the toughest guy, pound for pound, I ever knew in my whole life. And that takes an Albert Anastasia or any of them Brooklyn hoodlums or anybody anyone can think of. If there ever was a golden age of organized crime, it could be argued that it began with Lansky's descent into the underworld when he placed his first bet on a street corner craps game before the start of World War I, and ended when he died in the winter of 1983. Arnold Rothstein, the supposed fixer of the 1919 World Series, was the Cronus of American organized crime, the proto-godfather, if you will. Charlie Luciano stirred up the action, Benny Siegel provided the chutzpah, Lepke Buchalter terrorized the enemy, but Lansky rose above the fray and served as the brains of the outfit. Luciano was exiled and died relatively young. Siegel and Rothstein were assassinated, and Lepke died in Sing Sing's electric chair. But Meyer Lansky died a wealthy old man in Miami, Florida, where he was known as a supporter of Israel and a frequent contributor to the local public television station. Siegel was more likely to shoot first and ask questions later, as he lived and died by the gun. Buchalter, whose Stalin-esque purge of his own gang would signal his undoing, was the only mob kingpin to go to the electric chair. Lepke was easy to figure out. He was a cold-blooded killer who was all ego and only interested in profit. Siegel was just your basic psychopath. A nice guy one minute and a killer the next, Bugsy was a big talker and loud dresser who loved mixing it up and letting his fists do the talking. Luciano was a little more complex. Lucky killed guys, sure, but he had a sense of honor and nobility about him and seemed to recognize right and wrong, even if he ignored it. Lansky was different. He was a family man with a wife and kids and a brother. He'd learned a trade and operated legitimate businesses as well as carpet joints and bootleg operations. Lansky was one of the few mobsters who could rein in his passions, disdaining the spotlight, which attracted up-and-coming gunsels eager to make a name for themselves, as well as the law. He lived a nondescript life, a twice-married father of 3 children who preferred to let others do the dirty work for him. Meyer claimed in his biography never to have killed a man, although circumstantial evidence shows otherwise, and his exploits demonstrate that he wasn't completely averse to eliminating those who stood in his way. Where men like Lucky Luciano and Lepke Buchalter ruled their gangs through the standard mob methods of violence and fear, Lansky rose to the top of his profession because he was first a master organizer and, more importantly, a man of his word. Lansky was the brains behind the syndicate. His shrewd analytical mind was responsible for the creation of an international crime cartel, the effects of which are still with us today. This is the story of Meyer Lansky, the Russian immigrant who became known as the mogul of the mob. Legend has it that sometime in the 14th century, Jews were invited to settle in the then Lithuanian-controlled city of Grodno, a town on the border with Poland that was just beginning to make the change from a small agrarian village to a prosperous market town. The Lithuanians believed the Jews, reputed to be excellent craftsmen and tailors, could help bring commerce to the community. As in so many European cities, the Jews were tolerated when the community prospered. However, in Grodno, as in other cities, anti-Semitism was common. In the 17th century, the Russians, who had taken control of Grodno, wanted to expel all the Jews. At another time, the Eastern Orthodox priests ordered the Jews to brick up any window which faced the church. And still later, Jews were forbidden to speak Hebrew. Jewish children were sometimes kidnapped from their parents to be raised as Christians or to be ransomed by their families. Under the rule of czars, Jews in Grodno suffered greatly. There were restrictions on their business practices, and their rabbis were sometimes martyred at the hands of their Gentile neighbors. By the end of the 19th century, many Jews felt the pressure to emigrate as the Russian pogroms targeted them, their homes, and property. Among those who emigrated was Max Sokolansky, who in 1909 left his wife and 3 children behind in Grodno as he crossed the Atlantic to forge a new life in America. 2 years later, 10-year-old Meyer Sokolansky and his mother, brother, and sister followed Max to New York City. Max had saved the money to bring his family to America by working as a garment presser in the clothing manufacturing industry. On April 3, 1911, the SS Kursk landed at Ellis Island, and after numerous processing delays, the Sokolanskys were reunited in a tenement in the tough Brownsville section of Brooklyn. In the pre-World War I era, New York was teeming with immigrants from all over the world. To the 10-year-old Meyer, it was an exotic and fascinating place. I loved to walk around and see things I'd never seen before, like peaches and bananas and other exotic fruits, Lansky told Uri Dan, his biographer. I had no money to buy anything. I saw some other boys stealing, but I always remembered my mother telling me not to touch anything that did not belong to me. Shortly after moving to Brownsville, the Lansky family, the surname had been Americanized by Max shortly after he emigrated, moved to the Lower East Side of Manhattan. By no means a step up in the world, according to Lansky's biography by Robert Lacey. Meyer's mother Yetta was a dominant influence in his young life. His father was never able to overcome his depression over his abject poverty. And would only be a minor influence on his children. To please his mother was the most important thing to the young boy, and to let her down was unacceptable. For her part, Yetta Lansky was devoted to her children. She'd forego food for herself on those days when the cupboards were almost bare so that her children would not go hungry. And each week, she would scrimp and save for the Sabbath cholent, a traditional meal of potatoes and eggs, beans and vegetables. On the weeks when things were good for the Sokolansky family, there would be meat in the cholent. But more often than not, it was served as a meatless dish. Cholent is prepared before the Sabbath, for on the Sabbath, no cooking's allowed. On the Friday before the Sabbath, Meyer's mother would hand the cholent to her oldest son, and it was Meyer's job to take the dish down to the local bakery because the family didn't have an oven large enough to fit the dish. Proudly carrying the family's Sabbath dinner and a nickel to pay the baker for the privilege of using the large oven, Meyer would walk down Delancey Street past the small storefronts, pushcart vendors, and street corner craps games. On one fateful Friday, young Meyer, who had vowed that one day his family would have wealth, decided to risk the nickel on one of those street corner games. Although he'd never gambled before, Meyer had often watched in fascination as the Irish and Jewish immigrants played with what looked like a fortune to the youngster. Confident that he would win and would be able to return home with more money for his family, Meyer placed his bet. I handed the money over to the banker, sure I was going to win. And to my dismay, I lost it, he recalled years later. Nobody in the game paid any attention to me, and I stumbled away. For a long time, I couldn't go home. I felt worse than a criminal. I had let the family down. That Sabbath, there would be no cholent. It was a defining moment in the young boy's life. I was genuinely concerned at the way I'd upset my family, but what troubled me more than anything was that I'd lost that money, he said. That night before I went to bed, I swore to myself that one day I would be a winner. I would beat them all. Meyer began to watch the games more than ever, determined to learn the secret. He began to notice that other men would often stop by the crap games and collect winnings from the bankers manning the games. He also noticed that the bankers were using shills, men with whom the bankers were in cahoots, to get others to play the game. I kept my eyes wide open and soon understood the tricks, Lansky said. Then I decided it was time for me to try my luck again. This time I knew the rules, and I understood exactly how they were doing it. On the Friday before Sabbath, with a cholent in one hand and a nickel tightly grasped in the other, Meyer watched a game until he saw the shill place a bet. Following the shill's lead, the young man placed his own bet just as the dice were tossed. That was one of the most fateful moments of my life. It may sound very strange when only a nickel was at stake, but it was truly a turning point. Meyer won that bet like he knew he would, and for weeks he played the same game all over the Lower East Side. Moving from street to street, staying one step ahead of the bankers and shills, Meyer never gambled with the same cholent money again. Meyer had a head for figures, and his father, a hard-working gentleman who toiled in the sweatshops of the garment industry, was determined that his son would be a success. He decided that Meyer would excel in school and would grow up to be a mechanical engineer. In deference to his mother and his paternal grandfather Benjamin, who had made it to Jerusalem, Meyer continued his religious studies and at 13 was bat mitzvah. But Meyer was living a secret life as well. Lansky was taking his education from the public schools of New York, the schools that were meant to help immigrants develop the tools to realize the American dream and to indoctrinate them into the ways of their new home, and putting it to work on the streets of the Lower East Side. Hidden in a hole in his mattress was an ever-increasing bankroll, which the young man won by playing the street corner gambling games. As Meyer continued his solitary winning, he saw that the Jews of the Lower East Side were frequent targets of the organized Irish and Italian gangs. It wasn't so much an anti-Semitic assault as it was an attack on the less organized, law-abiding immigrants. One day, walking home from school, Meyer was set upon by a group of Sicilians, boys much older than Lansky, who demanded tribute from the teenager. The leader of this shakedown group was Salvatore Luciano, who had become better known to the world as Charlie Lucky Luciano. Salvatore liked picking on solitary Jews because they rarely fought back. But this time, he realized he'd cornered a small but dangerous opponent. "Pay up," Luciano told Lansky. Drawing on his past, on the way the Jews of Grodno had stood up to their oppressors time and time again, Lansky told Luciano to go F yourself. He would not pay 1 cent to the Italian, or anyone else for that matter. Years later, Lansky would tell an Israeli writer that he never got on my knees for any Christian, something of which Lansky was very proud. Standing toe-to-toe in the dirty snow of New York, Lansky and Luciano both realized that there was something special about the other. We both had an instant understanding, Luciano remembered later. It was something that never left us. Luciano and the Sicilians let Meyer pass without paying. In 1917, Lansky left school for good, a few weeks shy of his 15th birthday. Max Lansky, determined to have his eldest son do better than himself, got his son a job as an apprentice in a tool and die operation, with the hopes that one day Meyer would be a mechanical engineer. The foreman at the tool and die shop where he started to work used to praise his dexterity. Lacy writes in Little Man, Meyer Lansky in The Gangster Life. "You have golden hands," he told the youngster. "In 20 years, you'll be a professional worker and make good money. You'll earn $1 an hour." At the time, Lansky was working 52-hour weeks for 10 cents an hour. The 20-year climb to $1 an hour was a joke to the 14-year-old who could make that in a few rolls of the dice. Meyer continued to work at the tool and die shop, but he knew he would never be a professional worker. The most important education he was getting came from his work after the shop closed, when he and an Irish friend worked as strong-arm men in a crap game run by Udi and Willie Albert. In a few short years, Lansky was known to union organizers as a shtark, a strong-armer who would do violence for a price. It's as a shtark that Lansky's name first appears on the police blotters. In 1918, 16-year-old Meyer Lansky was charged with felonious assault, only to have the charges dismissed. Shortly afterwards, Lansky was arrested again, this time for disorderly conduct. Lacy alleges that Lansky was leaning on some of the local prostitutes on Madison Street in an effort to become a pimp. He pleaded guilty to the charge and was fined $2. In 1921, a year after the Volstead Act ushered in Prohibition, Lansky quit the tool and die shop. He never worked for anyone again, Lacy writes, and he was never again employed in a conventional job. As a youngster, we were beaten up daily by the Irish boys, Lansky recalled in his later years. And we had a choice. We could run away, or we could fight back. And fighting back meant everything connected with that. Standing up to the Irish and Italian gangs required Lansky and his friends to organize their own protective society. Between 1914 and 1920, Meyer and his younger brother Jake, who was everything Meyer was not, large of stature and slow of mind, were joined by Meyer Mike Wassel, Red Levine, Tabo Sandler, and Doc Stacher, who would remain a lifelong friend of Meyer's. Sometime in that 6-year period, Meyer Lansky would meet and become close friends with another man who would accompany him on his rise to the top of the syndicate. Lansky and Benny Siegel met, according to Meyer, on a street corner on the poverty-stricken Lower East Side of Manhattan when they were both young teens. The two were involved in a fight that arose from a street corner craps game when a gun was drawn and subsequently dropped. Lansky saw Benny reach for the gun and pointed at one of the combatants. Just as police whistles began to blow and the law drew near, Lansky hit Siegel's arm and forced him to drop the piece. "Are you crazy?" he shouted at Siegel. "Let's get out of here." The two youngsters ran away, although Benny could barely contain his rage at the older boy. "I needed that gun," he said. Despite the rocky beginning, Lansky and Siegel became fast friends and soon were the terrors of their neighborhood. Meyer was without a doubt the brains of the outfit, while Benny, a.k.a. Bugsy, was the brawn. Benny, the youngest member of the gang, was known on the streets as Che, the Yiddish word for untamed. He was a hothead, crazy as a bedbug, which gave him the nickname he came to loathe. Siegel was a loose cannon, and it seemed like only Meyer could handle him. It's said that opposites attract, and there are probably few friends who are as dissimilar as Lansky and Siegel. Benny was a flashy dresser who was quick to fight, and despite his high intelligence, was ruled by his passions. Meyer was the thinker, the one who never let his emotions overrule his head. Despite their differences, the two teens were closer than brothers. The Bugs and Meyer mobsters were equal opportunity thugs. They liked to shake down Jewish moneylenders and storekeepers, as well as Irish and Italian shop owners and gamblers. No one was safe from the gang. Thanks in no small part to Lansky's experience with automobiles and mechanics, the Bugs and Meyer mob were active in car theft and hijacking. The gang quickly became known as experts in transportation, with no job too big or dangerous. They fronted the operation thanks to a car and truck rental garage that served as a nice warehouse for swag. To the members of the early 20th century underworld, he was known simply as AR, or the Brain. His name was Arnold Rothstein, And in the years before Prohibition, he was arguably the most important and powerful gangster in the United States. Rothstein was a gambler and a dealmaker, and the man to see in New York City. He cavorted with killers and politicians alike, and there was probably nothing he couldn't fix, including, reportedly, the 1919 World Series. It's a testament to Rothstein's influence that in reality, he had nothing to do with the fix, but the gamblers who did used his name to impress the players involved. AR made his fortune by making deals and finding opportunities. Like a modern venture capitalist, AR bankrolled others who came to him with risky propositions. He also had the gift of being able to smell a good bet, whether it was at the gaming table or on the street, and had an eye for young hoods with potential. Rothstein was inspirational to many people, not just young gangsters like Lansky. AR provided the basis for the character of Meyer Wolfsheim in F. Scott Fitzgerald's masterpiece, The Great Gatsby, and was Damon Runyon's inspiration for Nathan Detroit and the character known simply as The Brain, who appeared in some of his plays. In early 1920, AR knew an easy way to make a lot of money. In January, the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution became law, ushering in the great American social experiment known as Prohibition. Like so many others, the Brain knew that a constitutional amendment wouldn't keep people from drinking. It would only serve to drive the drinking underground. The law of supply and demand, therefore, dictated that the price of liquor was going to go through the roof, and the Brain was determined to be in charge of supply. But AR was not the type of hoodlum who got his hands dirty. He needed partners. The Brain was looking for men who were smart enough to realize that there was still a market for high-class, expensive liquor, and who were tough enough to survive in the rough-and-tumble, dog-eat-dog world of bootlegging. Rothstein knew where to find such men. He looked to a pair of up-and-coming gangsters from Manhattan, Meyer Lansky and Charlie Luciano. Rothstein met Lansky at the bat mitzvah of the son of a mutual friend, and the Brain told Meyer he was impressed with the young man. He invited Lansky to his exclusive apartment at the Park Central Hotel, where the men had a 6-hour conversation about the future. AR wanted Lansky to go into business with him running booze. Rothstein told me quite frankly that he'd picked me because I was ambitious and hungry, Lansky recalled later, still somewhat in awe of AR. The Brain held a similar meeting with Charlie Luciano and would be a profound influence on the Sicilian. He taught me how to dress, how not to wear loud things, but to have good taste, Luciano recalled in his autobiography. He was the best etiquette teacher a guy could ever have, real smooth. Unlike other bootleggers who were interested in making a fast buck selling bathtub gin, Rothstein was intent on building a network of bootleggers who would only sell the best booze money could buy. If they know we're selling quality, he told Lansky and Luciano, they will pay for it. AR developed contacts with distilleries in Scotland who would sell him grade A scotch, which he then transferred to another minion, Irving Waxy Gordon in Philadelphia. He went to Waxy Gordon to arrange for distribution of the liquid gold, with the condition that I should have first call on the buy, Luciano wrote. Naturally, I bought every drop of it. Rothstein refused to allow his minions to cut the scotch with cheaper booze and forbade them from ripping off each other. To defy AR meant courting death. Rothstein, Lansky, Luciano, and Gordon developed a distribution system that made them all very rich men. A fifth of scotch on the boat cost the bootleggers $2.20 and easily sold on the street for 15 times that. We made what we called scotch right off the boat, Luciano said, and that original scotch would bring us as high as $1,000 a case. That case cost us, if you forget the danger part of it, only around $25. The economics of bootlegging was actually a little more complex than Luciano remembered. The supply of scotch and other whiskey had to be regular, so customs and federal agents had to be controlled. That cost money. There had to be plants to cut the whiskey in, so Lansky and Luciano went into the real estate business. They needed bottles that looked like the originals, so they bought a bottling company. They needed labels that looked exactly like the Johnny Walker, Haig and Haig, and Dewar's labels, so Lansky bought a printing operation complete with color presses. And trucks. Lots and lots of trucks. By the start of Prohibition, Lansky and Luciano, along with the Bugs and Meyer mob, were widely known in the underworld. Luciano had already attracted the attention of two of the leading gangster rivals for the title of Capo di tutti capo, boss of bosses. Both men, Giuseppe Masseria and Sal Maranzano, were not so gently pushing for Luciano to join their gangs. But Luciano was holding out because he developed a closer affinity with Meyer Lansky and was able to look past Lansky's Jewish heritage, something neither Masseria nor Maranzano, a couple of mustache Petes, could do. They wanted Luciano to dump Lansky and take over the territory the Bugs and Meyer gang had clawed out. The relationship between Luciano and Lansky was complex and very unusual for its time. Masseria and Maranzano, who headed the two most influential Italian gangs on the East Coast, refused to associate with anyone who wasn't a Sicilian. They were firm believers in the old way of doing things, the secret societies like the Black Hand, the Camorra, and the Mafia, which they brought with them from the old country. But Luciano and Lansky didn't let their different ethnic backgrounds stand in the way of friendship, partnership, and profit. As Luciano noted in his authorized biography, there was more to attract him to Lansky and Siegel than to repel him. The same ambitions, desires, and intensity transcended religious differences, wrote Martin Gorsch, Lucky's biographer. Lansky and Luciano were as tight as could be. They seemed to be on the same wavelength all the time, Siegel said. They'd just look at each other, and you'd know that a few minutes later one would say what the other was thinking, he told Doc Statcher. I never heard them argue. They were always in agreement with each other. The ethnic differences were sometimes the source of jokes between the men. Once, when Lansky, Siegel, Luciano, and Charlie's lieutenant were meeting to plan an attack on a warehouse, Lansky complained that the Jews were forced to take the risky jobs, while the two Italians sat back and watched. What do you mean, two Italians? We're one Wop, one Mick, and two Jews, just like in the neighborhood, said Luciano, using the current vulgar slang for Italians and Irish. Lansky stared at Luciano like he was nuts. What are you talking about, one Wop and one Mick? Where's the Mick? Luciano started to laugh and pointed at his Italian chum, Francesco Castiglia. Him, he's Irish, Frank Costello. And thus did Castiglia become Costello, a name later to be associated with the highest echelon of organized crime in New York City. The United Nations of crime grew and prospered. They bought boats for picking up loads of bootleg scotch and trucks to haul it in. Lansky and Siegel ran profitable gambling houses, and Luciano, much to the chagrin of Costello and Lansky, became an important bordello owner. The quartet and their hangers-on hit the pawnbrokers and moneylenders in the ghettos, and the insurance salesmen who collected nickel-and-dime premiums proved to be easy targets for the toughs. We had so much dough coming in that it was hard to keep track of it, Luciano said. Even a good counter like Lansky got a little confused once in a while. The group looked for ways to put their money to work for them. They bought into established bookmaking operations, the first stop in what would become a nationwide gambling syndicate. Lansky made them create what he called the Buy Money Bank, with a nest egg of $5,000, which was paid out by Costello to politicians and policemen who agreed to look the other way when the gang came into their wards. The Buy Money Bank was sort of an investment plan that paid off big for the men. Costello started small, buying the Pauls and Cops and ward healers in areas where the group was buying up bookies. The politicians, in turn, used the money to ensure election victories. By this time, the Italians and Jews of the Luciano and Bugs and Meyer mobs had attracted the attention of not only Rothstein, but of Maranzano and Masseria. As a powerful Italian, Luciano was drawn into the battle between the two old-timers despite his reservations. As a Jew, Lansky could only sit back and watch the battle and try to help his Sicilian friend. Later, once the forces of Masseria had been vanquished and Maranzano adopted the mantle of Capo di Tutti Capo, Lansky and Siegel would step in and, working closely with Charlie Luciano, who emerged from the 2-year Castellamarese War with the appellation Lucky, would bring true organization to organized crime. In the Castellamarese War, Maranzano and Masseria attacked each other ruthlessly in an effort to unite all the Italian underworld under one boss. Joe the Boss Masseria managed to woo Charlie to his side, only to see Lucky betray him to Maranzano when the balance of power shifted in favor of Salvatore. In return for betraying Masseria and helping in his murder, Luciano was awarded with a lieutenant's position in Maranzano's new underworld order. But Lucky had no intention of staying number 2 for long. Shortly after Maranzano became boss of bosses, Bugsy Siegel and Bo Weinberg, Dutch Schultz's number 2 man, burst into Maranzano's Union Siciliano office and shot him dead. Lansky and Luciano called a summit of the major underworld leaders in New York. Taking an idea from Johnny Torrio, who gave Al Capone his start in Chicago, they proposed a loose-knit syndicate of gangs. They stressed that this was not a unification under one boss, and no one would have to surrender any power to any other boss. The syndicate, Lansky and Luciano said, would serve as a cooperative venture to halt the tit-for-tat bloodshed that had claimed so many lives in the past few years. The syndicate would become a crime cartel, Lansky said. With Maranzano out of the way, Lucky and Meyer took their show on the road and went from city to city selling the idea of the syndicate. It was clear that this was a new day for the underworld. Lucky, who because of his extroverted personality took most of the spotlight, refused to accept the sealed envelopes filled with money that was the Mafia tradition. "The old Mafia traditions are fine for Sicily," he told the mobsters. "But we're in America. The idea of putting a crown on my head is kid stuff. It's time we grew up. We'll all work for each other, but each is running his own outfit." When Prohibition ended, Meyer turned from bootlegging to gambling, which was always his first love. He never really left it, but had merely turned his attention toward the most lucrative racket at the time. When the Volstead Act was repealed, Meyer was pulling in a cool $10,000 a year, about $125,000 in 1999 dollars. But as the country went wet, Meyer's income began to dry up. He was driven back to the expertise with which he'd won his first illegal nickel, wrote Lacey. Like Charlie and Benny, Meyer had kept his crap games going throughout the bootlegging years, and the end of Prohibition brought him back to his primary virtuosity, his original love. Unlike now, in 1933, every state except Nevada made gambling, save for horse and in some cases dog racing, illegal. In New York, there was a huge underground gambling network, but it floated in almost every sense of the word. The games were held on street corners, in back rooms, and in suites of hotels. But they were rarely permanent. In many cases, the games were rigged and their operators didn't worry about their reputations for fairness, because they'd be running the game blocks away by the next day. New York turned a blind eye to illicit gaming during the August racing season in upstate Saratoga Springs. A spa community known for its sulfur springs, as well as its racetrack and casino, Saratoga was a summer camp for hot Manhattanites roasting in the city 190 miles south. The racetrack opened during the Civil War, and after the war, Southern horse owners migrated north during the steamy summer months and brought with them the gambling games from their Mississippi riverboats. By the 1890s, the casinos of Saratoga in their month of summer glory rivaled those of Europe's most glamorous spas, Lacey writes. Saratoga's 2 principal hotels in the main street, the Grand Union and the United States, were the 2 largest hotels in the world. Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond, centered the novel Diamonds Are Forever around the spas and racetrack of Saratoga Springs, a town he was not particularly enamored of. In the book, Fleming calls Saratoga a stinking town, but then all gambling towns are, and points out how the city was permeated with the mob influence. By By the time Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano were in a position to have an effect on the market in Saratoga, AR was in charge of the spa town. He paid off the local officials and imported his dealers from New York, but he still operated in his traditional manner by having others do the real dirty work. Lansky and Luciano were brought in to fix things with the local Pauls, as well as to run the dining room and entertainment. It was through Rothstein's patronage that Meyer, Siegel, Luciano, and Costello honed the craft of casino and hotel operations. Lansky and his chums approached casino operations with the same scruples as they had in bootlegging. They knew the percentages were in their favor and that the short-term gains from running a crooked game could never match the almost unimaginable profits from a fair casino. Everyone who came into my casino knew that if he lost his money, it wouldn't be because he was cheated, Meyer said proudly. The little man recruited the best dealers and croupiers he could find and paid them a salary plus a commission, a percentage of the drop on their tables every night. This instilled loyalty and made the dealers pay closer attention to the gamers and to each other. In the years leading up to World War II, Lansky had slowly but surely developed a reputation that attracted the highest rollers and most influential gamblers. He was partners with Frank Costello and Joe Adonis in the Piping Rock, a Moorish-style building that exuded elegance. Uniformed valets parked the cars for gamblers, and Costello had imported his chef and maitre d' from his Manhattan club, the Copacabana. Having cut his teeth on the Saratoga Springs Casino, Lansky began to branch out. In New Orleans for the 1932 Democratic National Convention, Meyer and his friend Doc Stacher met with Louisiana Governor Huey Kingfish Long and arranged for the governor to open a Swiss bank account so that he could accept $3 to $4 million in cash annually that the mobsters were preparing to pay for the privilege of running casinos in the Big Easy. Deeply impressed by this sophistication, the governor gave his visitors from New York carte blanche, wrote Yuri Dan. The opening of the famous Blue Room at the Roosevelt Hotel and of the Beverly Country Club, also in New Orleans, was the beginning of the nationwide development of casinos. Leaving New Orleans, Lansky went north to Hot Springs, Arkansas, where he worked a similar deal and put Oni Killer Madden, former operator of the Cotton Club in Harlem, in charge. The Hot Springs setup was so luxurious and safe that it became known as a place for gangsters on the lam to hole up until the heat blew over. Lucky Luciano was extradited from Madden's Spa when he was indicted by New York State Prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey. Exercising considerable political muscle, Lansky proceeded to expand his gaming empire into Kentucky and eventually Florida. In Florida, carpet joints, as the illegal casinos were known, breathed life into the depressed South Beach communities of Hollywood, Hollandale, and Opa-locka. Just across the county line from Miami, some small-town casinos and bingo houses provided Lansky with the perfect setup for a South Florida empire. The good people of Broward County were not necessarily ambivalent toward the carpet joints that people like Meyer, Lansky, Jimmy Blue Eyes Allo, and Potatoes Kaufman were putting up on the outskirts of town. More than once, some high-minded citizens would approach a judge for an injunction against a particular piece of property, which would prevent the gamblers from operating on that site. The carpet joint owners would have to find another place to operate from, which created significant logistic problems for Lansky. So Meyer sent his brother Jake down to Broward County with a sack of cash. During the months preceding the reopening of a Lansky casino, his operations manager, Brother Jake, supervised the handouts. To the Benevolent and Protective Order of the Elks, to the Fort Lauderdale Shrine Club, and to the Hollywood Fishing Tournament, to the South Florida Children's Hospital. More than 24 local organizations began receiving generous and helpful donations from the new owners of the bingo parlor near the crossroads on US 1, wrote Lacey. The ploy worked, and there were no more complaints from citizens. With carpet joints running from Saratoga to Key West, Lansky attracted the attention of many different government officials. Some were on his payroll, others were his sworn enemies. But probably the most powerful government official to be drawn to Lansky wasn't even American. He was Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista, the former Army stenographer who had twice grabbed power in the Caribbean nation 90 miles south of Miami. In 1952, when Batista seized power, Cuba was known as the Paris of the New World. Europeans and Americans flocked to the sunny beaches and danced to the hot rumba rhythms of the Cuban big bands, drinking daiquiris and rums and smoking cigars. Gambling was big in Cuba too. But Batista had a problem. The games, it seems, were seen as crooked and no one was playing. Tourism started to falter as gamblers bypassed the Cuban casinos in favor of the more honest Puerto Rican joints. Things began to look bad for the dictator. Batista needed to inject some honesty into his games quickly, and he turned to Meyer Lansky. President Batista appointed Lansky his advisor on gambling reform and gave him the authority to clean up the crooked gaming houses like the Sans Souci and the Montmartre Club. Fulgencio Batista saw the enhancement of revenues from foreign visitors, and from Americans in particular, as a major source of future income for Cuba, and for himself, Lacy wrote. Lansky went to Havana and immediately began to rouse the crooked casino bosses. He kept Santo Traficante Jr., the son of Tampa's chief racketeer, but leaned on Sans Souci operator Norman Rothman to start running a clean game. He ordered dealers and croupiers, most of them American, who were crooked, to be deported and started the practice of dealing blackjack with a 6-deck shoe, which not only helped the house in terms of percentage, but minimized cheating by the dealer and player. While Meyer's reformed Montmartre Club was a place in Havana, he had long expressed an interest in putting a casino in the elegant Hotel Nacional, which overlooked El Morro, the ancient fortress guarding Havana Harbor. Meyer planned to take a wing of the 10-story hotel and create luxury suites for high-stakes players. Batista endorsed Lansky's idea over the objections of American expatriates like Ernest Hemingway, and the elegant hotel opened for business in 1955 with a show by Eartha Kitt. The casino was an immediate success. That spring, Lansky began working on his own casino, a 21-story, 440 skyscraper called the Riviera. When it opened, it would be the largest casino hotel in the world outside Las Vegas. The Riviera was Lansky's second attempt at building a hotel from scratch. The first was the ill-fated Flamingo Hotel in Vegas with his friend and partner Benny Siegel. In the mid-40s, things were pretty hot for Benny Siegel in New York. He was the key suspect in a murder, and Meyer Lansky was having a hard time keeping him under control. The two were still as close as ever, but Benny was chafing under Meyer's leadership. Bugsy needed to go out on his own, Meyer decided, and so Benny headed west to Los Angeles to bring the operations in California under the syndicate's control. Benny quickly rose to the top out west and began to expand the syndicate inland. He looked east to Nevada and saw a small town at the southern tip called Las Vegas. Siegel wasn't the first man to build a casino there, but he was the first mobster with syndicate connections to realize that putting a casino in Las Vegas could mean a license to print money for the mob. In the years since Benny moved out west to cavort with starlets and take over the Hollywood Extras Union, he and Meyer had remained close. Armed with mob money, Siegel tried in 1943 to buy his way into a partnership with the owners of the Last Frontier in Vegas, which was then the hotspot in town. The owners went public with Siegel's action and rejected him. Instead, Siegel and Lansky acquired El Cortez, a downtown hotel and casino that had been open for several years, serving both local clientele and soldiers from the nearby Army Air Base and Gunnery School. Meyer did not share Siegel's enthusiasm for Las Vegas, telling his friend the city was in sorry shape and concentrating on his carpet joints in Florida. He put up a $60,000 investment in El Cortez and became a silent partner, letting Siegel run the show. Soon after the men bought the casino, Siegel sold the operation and netted a $166,000 profit, a 27% return on their investment in just 6 months. In 1946, with the Las Vegas real estate market booming, Benny convinced the investors in El Cortez to reinvest in a bigger, larger, more fabulous new casino he was going to build. The Flamingo, named for his girlfriend Virginia Hill, would be a glitzy alternative to the Dude Ranch-style hotels like El Cortez and the Last Frontier. Lansky allowed Siegel to reinvest the $650,000 from the sale of El Cortez into the Flamingo, buying a 66% stake in the casino. As controller of the majority consortium, Benny set himself Christmas 1946 as his deadline for getting the Flamingo finished, Lacy wrote. But he immediately developed bright new ideas for improving the rooms. The charming and imperious Ben Siegel totally lacked his friend Meyer's sense of control. There were incredible cost overruns and delays caused in part by Siegel's ignorance of how to build a hotel of the magnitude of the Flamingo, and partly because of the booming post-war construction industry. In Havana, where Meyer Lansky, Lucky Luciano, and the rest of the heads of the syndicate were meeting in secret because of Luciano's exile, Lansky was forced to tell the bosses that the cost of the casino would far exceed the $1 million they'd been told. In fact, Meyer admitted, the Flamingo was likely to cost the syndicate about $6 million before it would be completed. Immediately, there were calls for Siegel's head, but Lansky was able to pacify them with promises of huge inflows of cash once the buildings were completed. What was unsaid at the meeting in Havana was that some mobsters were getting suspicious of the frequent trips Hill was making to Geneva, Switzerland, reportedly on buying trips. The gangsters believed Hill and Siegel were skimming investment money and secreting it away in a numbered Swiss bank account. This sort of behavior meant only one thing in the underworld, Doc Stacher said. Bugsy was going to be a hit. Meyer knew it too, but he did all he could to save his friend. Meyer talked the men into giving Bugsy until the spring to turn a profit, and then went to Las Vegas to try and talk some sense into his old friend. Benny had turned decorating control over to Virginia Hill, who was in many ways responsible for the overruns. When Meyer returned from Las Vegas, he was quite dejected. "I can't do a thing with him," Lansky told Stacher. "He's so much in that woman's power that he can't see reason." Luciano told Lansky that Bugsy would have to get things under control, or he'd order their old friend killed. "Unless Bugsy makes a great success of that hotel, you know as well as I do that he'll have to be hit," Luciano told his friend. "And if you don't have the heart to do it, Meyer, then I'll have to order the execution myself." Doc Stacher reported that Luciano's comments brought tears to Meyer's eyes, and he excused himself from the meeting with bosses. For 2 hours he remained in his suite at the Hotel National before calling friends in the States and ordering them to keep an eye on Benny. "If anything happens to him," he told Benny's lieutenant, "you will answer to me." Siegel managed to get the casino completed by his self-imposed December 1946 deadline, but not the hotel portion. On December 26th, the casino opened with Xavier Cugat's orchestra providing the music and Jimmy Durante and Rose Marie providing the comedic entertainment. At the gambling tables, nothing went right for the mobsters. Although in the long run, the house can't help but win because of the way the games are structured, in the short run, the guests at the Flamingo cleaned the casino out of $75,000 in the opening evening. Siegel managed to struggle on for 2 weeks before realizing that the casino would have to close when the hotel was being finished. Back in Cuba, Lansky once again saved Benny's life by coming up with a plan to put the Flamingo in receivership and setting up a new syndicate to buy out the old corporation. Luciano backed Lansky's plan, despite reservations by a number of other bosses. In March, the Flamingo reopened, and by April it was starting to get out of the red. In May, the casino turned a profit, but for some reason, it was too late to save Benny. In mid-June 1947, sitting in his apartment in Beverly Hills, Benny Siegel was gunned down by an unknown killer. Shortly after Siegel died in California, 2 men working for Meyer Lansky walked into the Flamingo and announced that they were taking over. Maurice Rosen and Gus Greenbaum had worked for Lansky in Miami, Havana, and New York, which gave a great deal of strength to the theory that, in the end, Lansky had ordered his best friend killed. Lansky, however, denied having anything to do with Benny's killing. "Ben Siegel was my friend until his dying day," he told Uri Dan. "I never quarreled with him. If it was in my power to see Benny alive," he added, "he would live as long as Methuselah." Meyer Lansky's religious upbringing and cultural background as a Jew played conflicting roles in his lifetime. He was never particularly religious after leaving his parents' home. Neither of his sons was bat mitzvahed, and after the death of Lansky's father, he chose not to continue the Hebrew tradition of honoring the father on the anniversary of his death. Whether that was because of Lansky's disdain for his weak father, or because he turned his back on his faith, is really unknown. "He was never Jewish-minded when we were growing up," said his son Buddy. "The Christmas tree, the bacon, no bat mitzvah. We didn't know what Jewish was." As time went on and Lansky grew older, his Jewish heritage came to mean more and more to him. He visited Israel for the first time when he was almost 60 years old, and the visit to the Holy Lands reignited a passion for his culture. In 1970, hounded by the police, wiretapped by the FBI, and under surveillance at every turn, Meyer Lansky decided to join his friend Doc Stacher in Israel. After living in Israel for several months, Lansky decided to take advantage of the country's unique immigration law, the Law of Return, which states that every Jew in the world is eligible to become an Israeli citizen. Every Jew, save for those with a criminal past likely to endanger the public welfare. Lansky engaged several attorneys in order to secure his rightful place as an Israeli citizen. "I have no criminal past which is likely to cause a breach of the peace, and I'm not now likely to endanger the peace of any country," Lansky wrote to the Ministry of Interior. Things looked favorable for Lansky and his second wife Teddy until the Israeli press caught wind that Meyer Lansky, the chairman of the mob board of directors, was in Tel Aviv. Photographers stalked the Lanskys, and newspapers reported that he was planning on continuing his racketeering in Israel. It wouldn't have been hard to do, but Lansky was fairly close to being retired by this time. In the end, when Israel's Prime Minister Golda Meir found out Lansky was connected to the Mafia, she intervened in the naturalization process, and Lansky was turned out of the country. From Israel, Lansky traveled to Zurich and quickly left Switzerland for South America. He was trying to stay one step ahead of the FBI, which wanted to arrest him on racketeering charges, but Paraguay would not accept him either, and he was placed on an airplane whose final destination was Panama City, Florida. There would be no escape for Lansky this time. Immediately after the plane touched down in Florida, FBI agents arrested Lansky, and he was held until he posted a $250,000 bail. From jail, Lansky checked into the Mount Sinai Hospital for observation. The stress of the 13,000-mile journey from Tel Aviv to South America through Latin America to Florida had taken its toll on the heart of the 70-year-old Lansky. In the federal court in Miami, Meyer Lansky, proclaimed by the Miami Herald as the Gangland Finance Chairman, was convicted of contempt of court for failing to return from Israel 2 years earlier to answer a grand jury's questions. He was sentenced to a year and a day in jail. Soon afterward, with his contempt conviction on appeal, Lansky was tried for tax evasion, despite his ill health and need for oxygen and almost constant medical attention. The jury in this case took little time in finding against the government and for Lansky. Meanwhile, the Fifth Circuit Court overturned his contempt conviction. Finally, the third case, which had precipitated Lansky's deportation from Israel, was dropped by the government after an unfavorable ruling by the judge. "He was able to go to his grave laughing that he whipped us all," said one FBI agent. Lansky lived an additional 6 years after his final court battles. In that time, he never gave up hope of returning to Israel, either as a tourist or as a citizen. But his health became poor, and on January 15, 1993, Meyer Lansky, the mastermind of the mob, died at his home. He would have been chairman of the board of General Motors if he'd gone into legitimate business, an agent of the FBI once said of Meyer Lansky with grudging admiration, wrote the New York Times in his obituary. And in a moment of triumph, Mr. Lansky once boasted to an underworld associate, "We're bigger than U.S. Steel." Superlatives and apocryphal statements filled the little man's obituaries. He was called treasurer of the mob, frequent advisor to the Chicago mob, and the most influential godfather in the history of American organized crime. In all the hyperbole on a poor weekend for news, Only the Miami Herald pointed out that Lansky's reputation was a matter of popular belief, never proven legally, and that Lansky's links to mob killings were more by speculation than by proof, Lacey wrote. Bugsy Siegel once told a non-mobster that people had nothing to fear from men like himself and Lansky. You see, he said, we only kill each other. But even though Meyer Lansky was never convicted of murder, shunned criminal enterprises like narcotics and prostitution, and gave people the illicit things they really wanted, like alcohol and gambling, he shouldn't be dismissed as just an interesting underworld figure. Every time an honest citizen buys clothes, they're paying for protection from the garment industry racketeers. And in many cities, particularly large ones, garbage collection includes the hidden cost of mob tribute. Payoffs made to crooked politicians help them remain in office and contribute to the malaise that Americans feel about our political system. Meyer Lansky didn't invent graft, and he didn't install the protection rackets in the unions and garment industry. But it was through his guidance that the syndicate was able to prosper in the United States. He might not have been the one to suggest the idea that the mob get involved in narcotics, but his system of cooperation between various gangsters, regardless of race or ethnic background, paved the way for today's organized gangs. He prided himself on his honesty and his commitment to working a fair deal, but his vision has been perverted by others with fewer scruples. If Meyer Lansky has left a legacy, it's in the widespread corruption which pervades our society. In the final analysis, Meyer Lansky was a criminal. He could have devoted himself to building an honest career where a man with his talents could have gone far. Maybe anti-Semitism held him back. Maybe not. But the fact that he chose to be a criminal rather than a law-abiding lifestyle means any admiration we feel for Meyer Lansky should be mixed with contempt.